Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Co-Biome's live webinar, First Do No Harm, Antimicrobial Herbs and the Gut Microbiome. I'd first like to introduce our speakers for this evening. My name is Hayley Parcell. I'm a nutritionist and the head of Co-Biome Healthcare, and I'll be your host for this evening. We're also joined by Dr. Brad Leech, who is a clinical nutritionist specialising in complex gastrointestinal disorders and the lead clinical educator here at Co-Biome. Brad's research has focused on intestinal permeability, autoimmune disease management, food-based probiotics, and integrative healthcare management. And lastly, Dr. Paula Smith-Brown is a PhD qualified paediatric accredited practicing dietitian and Co-Biome's healthcare science liaison. As both an experienced microbiome researcher and a healthcare professional, Paula is uniquely placed to translate the latest science on the gut microbiome into practical clinical application. Before we begin tonight, I just want to run through a couple of housekeeping items. So firstly, all participants have been muted to ensure that we run to time tonight. And there is a Q&A, a 15-minute Q&A at the end. So please feel free to add your questions at any time in the chat, and we'll make sure to come back to those at the end of the presentation. In the spirit of reconciliation, Co-Biome acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of today. And just a couple of disclaimers. We'd just like to reiterate that this webinar is for qualified health professionals only, and the information contained in this webinar is in no way to be taken as prescriptive or to replace a healthcare professional's duty of care and personalised care practices. And lastly, the clinical opinions and patient case studies shared by presenters are solely those of the individual presenters and do not necessarily represent the view of Co-Biome. Recent advancements in technology have given us a deeper insight into how certain compounds and constituents may be impacting the gut microbiome. This challenges our thinkings on the best course of action in managing gut pathogens, but we might want to consider the use of antimicrobials to address pathogens. And what are the alternative options in the management of pathogens? There's no doubt that we are covering a rather controversial topic tonight, and this may initiate some tough conversations as we challenge our thinking and previous learnings. It's our endeavour at Co-Biome to keep on top of the latest microbiome science and have the courage to share the latest findings with our health professional community as we all unite to improve patient outcomes together. Which is why in tonight's webinar, we look to the Hippocratic Oath of First Do No Harm and how the latest evidence may be evolving the way in which many of us have traditionally managed our patients' microbiomes in practice with antimicrobial herbs. We're committed to providing clinically useful information, and we hope that you walk away tonight armed with new considerations and ways to evaluate and prescribe for gut microbiome health. So I will now hand over to our first presenter of the evening, Dr. Brad Leech.
Fantastic. And thank you very much, Hayley, for that introduction. All righties, let's get into the impact of antimicrobial herbs on the microbiome. I want to start off by telling you a little story about my journey in clinical practice and how the way I treat my patients have evolved over the years. So I've been seeing patients since 2008 as a herbalist and then as a nutritionist. Now, in my early days of seeing patients, I made a number of recommendations that upon hindsight, I look back on and go, would I have made those same recommendations today? Some of these concepts that I believe to be accurate were the need of prescribing lactobacillus probiotics if my patient didn't have any lactobacillus in their gut. Another example is using high-dose antimicrobial herbs. Now, although I had great results, a number of my patients actually had their symptoms come back after a period of time. So I knew something was missing. And so I, as any clinician would, I did some research. I studied, I did further education to really understand why and how these antimicrobial herbs might be impacting my patients and how I can better support my patients. So with that, I've got two questions that I want you to reflect on during this presentation. The first is, are antimicrobial herbs the best option to be treating all pathogens and pathobionts? And the second question is, what are the other options available for treating pathogens and pathobionts? So I think it's really important that we as clinicians have a comprehensive understanding on the different terminology that we use to describe different groups of bacteria and microbes. The first one I want to discuss more about is this concept of pathogens. So a pathogen is a microbial strain that can actually cause disease. Now, they're quite a serious consequence. And if you have a pathogenic strain, and depending on your clinical symptoms, this may require a medical referral or medical treatment. You also have an opportunistic pathogen. This is a microbial strain that can cause a disease in a susceptible individual. Now, I give the example of my grandmother with stage 4 cancer. If I had an opportunistic pathogen, I may not experience any adverse clinical symptoms. However, if my grandmother does, then she's more likely to have adverse clinical reactions due to having this pathogenic strain. So it really depends on the individual. The next is a pathobiont. So this is a microbial species associated with a negative health outcome. Now, these species, they're growing in number, and our understanding through cross-sectional data on linking particular species to a negative health outcome. And it's something that we as clinicians used to refer to as dysbiotic bacteria, but now we've got this more nuanced understanding to refer to them as a pathobionts. The last term, which is important to understand, is the concept of commensals. So a commensal is a microbial species associated with a positive health outcome. We want these guys. These are the good species based on cross-sectional data. Now, as clinicians, we see a variety of different conditions in clinical practice. But when may clinical signs and symptoms indicate a potential pathogen or pathobionts? So if a patient presents with nausea, abdominal pain, bloating, or diarrhea, flatulence, a loss of appetite, these may indicate that the patient may have a pathogen or pathobionts. What is quite fascinating is, in our traditional understanding, we believed that if somebody had a pathogen, then it required eradication through antimicrobial, whether it's an antimicrobial herb or an antibiotic. But now we've got this more advanced understanding of the microbiome, and understanding that the microbiome may have a profound impact on health and disease. We now have this understanding that perhaps that's not the case. So I want to talk a little more about antimicrobials. So antimicrobials, particular compound found in a number of different herbs, such as golden seal, oregano oil, nigella. We've even got garlic, pomegranate. All of these are considered to be antimicrobial herbs. So as naturopaths, traditionally, we were taught that antimicrobial herbs can be selective and non-selective. Now, I say traditional because this concept of selective and non-selective is being challenged at the moment. So traditionally, a selective antimicrobial herb works by suppressing the growth of a particular pathogen, such as E. coli, whereas a non-selective antimicrobial herb can actually have impacts on beneficial bacteria, such as your bifidobacterium. Because the vast majority of research out there does not look at the whole microbiome, we don't fully understand whether or not herbs can be selective. So our current understanding is that the vast majority of herbs are actually non-selective. One of these non-selective antimicrobial herbs, or compounds, might I say, that I want to focus on is berberine. So berberine is found in golden seal and philodendron, and it's quite a popular antimicrobial compound found in a number of different supplements used within complementary and integrative medicine. The reason why I want to shed some light on berberine is because in the last few years, these two papers have been published, which has changed the way I treat patients. It's changed the way I view and use antimicrobial herbs in clinical practice. So let's actually look at the data from these studies. These two studies, well-constructed studies looking at diabetic and hypoglycemic patients. One study used 600 milligrams of berberine twice daily for 12 weeks, whereas the other study used 500 milligrams of berberine twice daily for 16 weeks. What makes these two studies unique and novel and different to the vast majority of any other study done on antimicrobial herbs is, for the very first time, these studies have used metagenomic sequencing to look at the whole microbiome rather than just individual species or through culture. The other thing I'll mention is this first study actually uses FDR correction, which basically means the results can be viewed as quite accurate, whereas the second study, the results are viewed as exploratory. So let's look at what these studies actually found. What these studies found was an increase in disease-associated species. So after participants completed the study of taking berberine supplementation based on their microbiome, there was an increase in disease-associated species. So you can see some of these species based on cross-sectional data include an increased risk of Crohn's disease, intestinal inflammation, colorectal cancer, type 1 diabetes. That's not what we want in clinical practice. But perhaps the thing that I found most fascinating is when you actually look at the function of these species, so what these species are actually doing within our gut, the vast majority were actually what we refer to as hexa-LPS producers. That is, they produce hexa-LPS. Based on the research, we know that hexa-LPS is pro-inflammatory for both systemic inflammation and gut inflammation, and it can also contribute to loss of barrier integrity, intestinal permeability. So this type of microbiome is not what we want for our patients. Now, the plot thickens. The research also showed that there was a decrease in health-associated species. So you can see that after the use of berberine supplementation, there was a reduction in your bifidobacterium species, and also species that are protective, species that reduce the risk of chronic disease, such as insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and Crohn's disease. But again, when you actually look at the function of the microbiome, because we can view the function because they utilize metagenomic sequencing, we can see that the vast majority of these were butyrate producers or supported with the production of butyrate. So that's not what we want for our patients. The question on many people's mind right now is, well, how long have we known this? Is this novel? Well, in the late 90s, the technology of measuring the microbiome was quite crude, but based on cell culture, we could actually see that berberine inhibited the growth of particular bifidobacterium species, while it had no impact on E. coli. Whereas we can now confirm this in a way, looking at it from a human-based level using metagenomic sequencing, we can see, based on the previous results, that berberine reduced these bifidobacterium species while actually increasing pathobionts and disease-associated species. So your take-home message when it comes around to the use of berberine supplementation within clinical practice is the research is still evolving. But based on the early research, it does appear that using berberine at higher doses can actually reduce bifidobacterium species, increase disease-associated species, reduce health-associated species, and impact butyrate and hexa-LPS producing species. So as a herbalist, I want to give you a few tips and tricks when it comes around to thinking about or utilizing antimicrobial herbs in some clinical situations. So if I was to use an antimicrobial herb in a particular situation, then I would prioritize extracts and tinctures over the oil of antimicrobial herbs. I would utilize pulse dosing, where I use 1 week on, 1 week off. I would use short term, so extremely short term. And then I'd also utilize antimicrobial herbs that may have a prebiotic action, such as pomegranate husk extract. Now, I understand that with the advancement of herbal medicine, we can actually increase the absorption of antimicrobial herbs within the small intestines, thereby less ends up within the large intestine, impacting the microbiome. So if I was utilizing an antimicrobial herb for systemic health rather than impacting the microbiome, then I'd look towards a highly bioavailable antimicrobial herb. I'll now pass over to Dr. Paula Smith-Brown.
Thank you so much, Brad, for that wonderful overview of the emerging science for the impact of antimicrobials on the whole microbiome. We're now going to start looking at more of the clinical application of different technologies for the identification of potential pathogens, and as well as the factors that we will consider in determining which patients require medical management. So if I suspect a potential pathogen in my patient, traditionally you would use a targeted pathogen panel, but we now have the opportunity to combine that with metagenomic sequencing to provide complementary information to give a more complete picture of what's happening in our patient's microbiome. Generally, targeted pathogen panels use PCR. So let's take a look at this technology and compare it to metagenomics. So PCR is used to support diagnostic accredited pathogen detection. It's a very highly sensitive detection method, but will only identify the particular targets that it's looking for. It'll only tell you if they're there or not, but no other information about the microbiome. When we look at the limitations, PCR targets are quite different in terms of how specific they are for their targets. So some are detecting toxigenic genes, others are particularly distinguishing pathogenic strains, while others are less specific and are simply showing the identification of a species or of a group of species within a genus. So it does require some nuance within the clinical interpretation. Another factor that must be considered in the clinical interpretation is that PCR is so sensitive that it can distinguish insignificant levels of microbes. In contrast, metagenomics gives a complete picture of the whole microbiome. It identifies all the microbes that are present at above 0.01% relative abundance and identifies them accurately at the species level. This allows the identification of all species within the database, so up to 28,000 different species, but remembering that a typical healthy sample will contain around 110 to 244. At this stage, metagenomics is not a diagnostic test for detecting pathogens and generally is not able to distinguish pathogenic strains. It's more comparable to the PCR targets that targets the species and genus level. So let's move on to a little bit more of a specific example, and we'll use Campylobacter for this. So Campylobacter is a common cause of bacterial diarrhea disease in Australia. Risk factors include eating undercooked poultry, having a puppy, and regular use of PPIs. So traditionally, we might have used a targeted pathogen panel that looks at Campylobacter as a group to detect whether they are there. But in fact, although the pathogen panel tells us it's looking at the whole group of Campylobacter, in fact, it's only looking for 2 species within that group. And those are Campylobacter D. jejuni or Campylobacter D. coli. So the pathogen panel is really saying, are those 2 species there or not? And it's a highly sensitive way of detecting that. Now, if you combine that with metagenomics, what that's doing is detecting all of the Campylobacter species that are in your patient's microbiome at above 0.01% relative abundance. So that could include potentially pathogenic Campylobacter that are not covered by the pathogen panel, but it could also include other Campylobacter species, such as Campylobacter b hominis, which is the most common Campylobacter species that we see and has not been associated with any diseases or pathogenesis. Another benefit of combining the pathogen panel with metagenomics is that we can get a wider diversity of species detected. So when we look at the protist parasites, Dientamoeba fragilis has actually to date not had its whole genome sequenced. So what that means is that we cannot detect Dientamoeba fragilis using metagenomics. And therefore, the only way to find whether a patient has that present is to use the pathogen panel. In contrast, the pathogen panels are only sensitive enough to detect blastocystis at the genera level. So we can't tell which subtype or which blastocystis species is present. And we know that different subtypes have different clinical implications. So in that situation, using metagenomics is more specific and will tell us not just that blastocystis are present, but which subtypes are present. So just a reminder that the pathogenic role of Dientamoeba fragilis and blastocystis is very debated. So traditionally, we would have used stool collections and looking microscopically for these, and that's a rather difficult way to find them. But since the introduction of widespread PCR testing to look for these, there has been a much higher detection of Dientamoeba fragilis and blastocystis in the general population. And the clinical implications of this is still not clear. Although we do have rare cases where it does seem to cause pathogens, we're having it much more commonly found where there's no evidence that it's causing any symptoms in that patient. So based on this, the RCPA have produced guidelines to say that the detection of Dientamoeba fragilis and blastocystis alone do not require antimicrobial treatment. And in fact, this often won't clear the protist parasite and is more likely to disrupt the normal gut microbiome. They say that if someone is symptomatic, all other causes should be excluded before attributing blame to the Dientamoeba fragilis or the blastocystis. And of course, if someone is not symptomatic, we would not be worrying about the presence of those being detected. They also suggest that if you do choose to target the Dientamoeba fragilis or blastocystis, that screening for clearance of organisms is not recommended. The reason for that is these are organisms that can be particularly get a positive even when it's just fragments of the killed microbes that are left. And they also suggest that there is no benefit in testing of family members. So let's broaden to the other potential pathogens that we might find to get some exploration of what we might do in that clinical scenario. So really what we do with the results really depends on what we understand about the particular pathogen, how sensitive the test is, but also the clinical presentation. So Entamoeba histolytica is an emerging pathogen of some significant public health concern. It can very easily be transmitted through the community. So the current medical advice is that if it's detected, even if the person is asymptomatic, medical treatment is recommended to prevent the spread of this pathogen through the community. When using the pathogen panel, it is detecting pathogenic strains of C. difficile and E. coli. So we know from that result that it is a pathogenic strain there. But what we don't know is if it's present at a level that's clinically significant. So this is where we need to look at the patient's symptoms. If a patient has C. difficile pathogenic strains or Giardia identified and they are showing symptoms, then generally this person would require medical treatment. For the E. coli pathogenic strains, they actually cover a very diverse group of organisms that can cause a very different clinical picture, ranging from sort of traveler's diarrhea to quite serious complications of gastroenteritis. So in this situation, if you are not a medical doctor, the advice is that you should refer to a medical doctor so they can make a complete assessment of the patient and determine whether medical treatment is needed. When we think of the other pathogen panel targets, they are not necessarily detecting pathogenic strains. They may be detecting species or groups of species that may contain pathogenic strains in them, but may not be present in your patient. So again, what you need to do in this circumstance is make an assessment of the clinical presentation. If it's a metagenomic detected potential pathogen, you may choose to send them for further diagnostic testing before determining the next steps clinically. And finally, the reminder that for Dientamoeba fragilis and blastocystis, it really is the last option to try and target those, because it's much more likely to cause collateral damage to the microbiome than it is to eradicate them. And there is suggestions that they are sometimes unfairly blamed for symptoms when they just happen, they're sort of innocent bystanders. Other factors we may be looking at in our patient test results to indicate the requirement for medical assessment may be the gastrointestinal health markers. And there are 3 gastrointestinal health markers which we would consider red flags. So these are an elevation in calprotectin, an elevation in lactoferrin, and the detection of fecal occult blood. The reason these are considered red flags is that they can be indicative of fairly serious conditions that require immediate medical assessment. And these include inflammatory bowel disease and colorectal cancer. So if these results are present in your patient and they are unexpected, it is important to ensure that they're appropriately medically investigated. But it's also important to bear in mind that these are markers of intestinal inflammation. They are not specific for the cause of that intestinal inflammation. So it may be inflammatory bowel disease, could be cancer, but it could also be a sign of a inflammatory gastroenteritis or bacterial diarrhea. We also want to take particular care of vulnerable patients or those at risk of very severe symptoms, and patients who've had very persistent symptoms. Now, when I'm going through all of these, we really need to think that these are rules of thumb. And what you must always do as a clinician is trust your own judgment. Clinical context must always be the primary consideration. Look at the patient in front of you, not just the test results. And when in doubt, refer for a medical assessment or a second opinion. So in summary, if I suspected a pathogen infection in my patient, I would be looking to get the traditional targeted pathogen panel. But to get the complete picture, I would also like to combine that with gastrointestinal health markers, which give me an indication of what's happening in the gut environment, and also a complete assessment of the microbiome using metagenomics. So we'll now spend some time looking at how we would gather all of this information to provide a complete assessment of what's happening in the microbiome and the gut environment, which can help lead to us to create a sort of diagnosis of what we believe the root cause of our patient's symptoms are to create appropriate treatment strategies. So, using metagenomics, we can measure the microbiome by looking at the diversity, looking at the species that are present, but also looking at the functional potential of the microbiome to produce or consume metabolites associated with health. By adding in gastrointestinal health markers, we can put this in context of the environment by looking at whether there are any alterations in gut function and environment. And all of this combined with the traditional pathogen panel can really give us a complete assessment of what's happening in our patient. So let's look at each one of these factors in turn. So the first place we might look at is the richness and diversity, which gives us a nice overall assessment of what's happening in the microbiome. So richness is just a fancy way that scientists say the number of species that is in the microbiome. So quite simply, a low richness means low levels of species, and a high richness means high levels of species compared to our healthy cohort. And remembering that a healthy person's sample will contain around 110 to 244 species. Diversity is actually a combination of measures of richness and also evenness in the microbiome. So a low level of diversity can mean that there's a low level of species, but it can also mean that certain species are dominating the microbiome. They're having a bit of an unfair influence on the overall potential of the microbiome, whereas a diverse microbiome is one that has lots of species and they are evenly spread. It's a nice democracy. They can be working together as a team. So why do we care about diversity? Well, what we know from the science is that a microbiome that's diverse is a microbiome that's resilient and stable. So what this means clinically is that if I have a patient who has a low level of diversity, I might be particularly careful about using treatments such as antimicrobials that may further disrupt that fragile microbiome. In contrast, if I have a patient who has a dysbiotic microbiome, but it's very diverse, I might choose to use more aggressive treatment strategies because I know that that dysbiotic microbiome will be more resilient to change. We may then turn our attention to who's in the microbiome. And one of the benefits of metagenomics is that it doesn't just look at the bacteria, but also all microbes within the microbiome. In particular, you may be interested to see whether your patient's microbiome contains fungi. Now, when we use whole microbiome sequencing, what we've confirmed in the science is that although fungi are an important component of the microbiome, they actually make up a very small proportion of it, so normally less than 0.01%, so not covering that level of detection for whole microbiome sequencing. So as a result at Microbia, we actually only find fungi in around 2% of samples. And the fungi species that we find the most is Saccharomyces group A, also known as brewer's yeast. And through Microbia's science review, we were able to find papers that showed that when they put people on completely yeast-free diets, they are unable to detect Saccharomyces in their guts, in their samples. And the reason for that is that these species are not part of the microbiome. They are visitors that are coming from dietary intake and just transitory visiting. So if you find Saccharomyces in your patient's microbiome, it means they likely ate something with brewer's yeast in it a few days prior to taking their sample. And sources of this can include beer, but also things like sourdough bread. And some people also take brewer's yeast as a supplement. Another benefit of metagenomics is it can really drill down to which species are present. So a good example of this is Streptococcus. So Streptococcus as a genus has had a bit of an unfair tarnishing as being a pathogen. And you may think, oh, there's Streptococcus, they're most likely pathogenic. And of course, Streptococcus does have some very famous pathogenic strains or species within it. A very famous one would be Strep A or Streptococcus pyogenes, which causes diseases such as scarlet fever, tonsillitis, and impetigo, which are the awful school sores that children get. But in fact, it's very rarely found in the gut, and there's no known disease associations with it being found in the gut. So although it's a pathogen, it's not considered a pathobiont when found in the gut. In fact, when we look at our data, the species that we find most commonly, the Streptococcus species that we find most commonly are Streptococcus thermophilus and Streptococcus salivarius. But again, even these species have quite different clinical implications. So Streptococcus thermophilus is the probiotic bacteria used to make yogurt, and research would suggest it has health benefits. So it can support lactose digestion in people who have lactose intolerance, and animal studies show that it has a high anti-inflammatory potential. In contrast, Streptococcus salivarius is actually a species that is a common inhabitant of the mouth. It's an oral species. It's more adapted to living in an environment of the mouth rather than the gut. And when we find high levels in the gut, it has been shown to be associated with diseases such as hypertension, Crohn's disease, and atherosclerosis. So this really highlights the point of not saying, okay, there's Streptococcus in my, just saying there's Streptococcus in my patient, must be pathogenic, I must treat it, but really drilling down to which species are present and what does that mean for my patient's clinical presentation. So it's actually not just Streptococcus as an oral species that gets the bad rap here. In fact, there is research to show that increased oral species in general could be suggesting alterations in the gut environment. So when Microba did its science review, we actually found A-grade evidence, so that's systematic reviews of papers which show that patients who use PPIs have an increased abundance of oral bacteria in their fecal samples. But at this stage, that included science that had used lots of different technologies, so we could only confirm that to the genus level. And of course, as we've been making it very clear, it's important to get down to the species level. And we do have some metagenomic studies coming out which confirm that, again, patients who have used PPIs do have an increased abundance of oral bacteria at the species level. And the list here shown on the slide is the oral species that were shown to be statistically significantly increased in those patients who took PPIs compared to those who did not. And really what that's suggesting to us is that the PPIs, which are cutting back the stomach acid, are allowing species that are actually evolved to live in the mouth, which is an area with lots of oxygen, to pass into the gut, and changing the gut environment, changing the gut community, which and in this situation, these aren't necessarily pathobionts that need to be targeted. They are a signal that the gut environment needs to be supported. So how can you tell if your patient has oral species? In the next few days, we will be releasing the MetaExplore v2.0 report, which will have numerous improvements. But one of these is a filter function that will allow you to easily filter the species table to determine whether there are any archaea, fungi, protist parasites, or oral species within your patient's microbiome. Now, oral species, as we saw for the Streptococcus salivarius, are still quite common. They're in about a third of samples. So we're not necessarily concerned if they're there. What we're concerned about is if they're overabundant. So this is where we need to rely on the distance to average score here, which gives us an idea of how elevated these species are compared to the healthy cohort. So the higher the score, the more abundant they are. And particularly a score over 2 is where I'd be particularly paying attention. So if your patient has numerous oral species and they're overabundant, that's suggesting that that gut environment is promoting the growth of oral species rather than the species that typically live in a healthy gut environment. Another benefit of metagenomics is it can tell us about the functions of the microbiome. So we may be used to the terminology of dysbiosis, which refers to an imbalance in the microbial community. And generally, when we talk about that, we're talking about dysbiosis in the species. So we may be looking to overabundance of pathobionts and underabundance of commensal microbes. But perhaps what's more relevant clinically is there an altered capacity of the microbiome to produce microbial metabolites or consume compounds which may be influencing the patient's health? And we would call that functional dysbiosis. So examples of functional dysbiosis may be a reduced capacity of the microbiome to make microbial compounds which are beneficial for health. So these may be butyrate or IPA, for example, or an increased capacity of the microbiome to produce compounds which are detrimental to health. So this could include hexa-LPS or methane. So once we've got an established information about the microbiome, we want to be able to put it in context of the overall gut function. And this is where the combination of gastrointestinal health markers really shines. So we've covered the role of calprotectin, lactoferrin, and occult blood as red flag markers, but they are also signs of active intestinal inflammation combined with secretory IgA. If a patient has increased secretory IgA and increased zonulin levels, that suggests that there may be some intestinal permeability in their gut. And fecal pH is provided as a proxy for gut transit time. And in particular, we found studies to show that osmotic diarrhea can particularly cause a reduction in fecal pH. So if you have a patient who's having chronic diarrhea and the pathogen panels have ruled out any pathogenic cause, and you see a reduced level of fecal pH, that may lead your clinical reasoning down to things like lactose or fructose intolerance, or perhaps even the excessive use of lactulose or other osmotic laxatives. So in conclusion, by looking at all of this information combined, I can put together a theory as to what is the root cause of my patient's symptoms and ask what is the potential benefit of my treatment, but also what are the potential collateral damage that might occur. So I might ask myself, how resilient is this microbiome to disruption? Is there dysbiosis in the species present? Is there functional dysbiosis? Are there red flag markers that require medical investigation? And if a pathogen is detected, I will be thinking about how specific that test is and really considering it within the clinical presentation. So I'll now hand back to Brad, who will take us through now his clinical reasoning of how he would use all this information to put together treatment plans.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Paula. That was very informative, and I'm sure everyone has a more comprehensive understanding of pathogens and pathobionts. So we're going to take what we've just learned and we're going to apply the management view on how we're going to support and manage our patients with a potential pathogen or a pathobiont. So what I have here for you is 4 steps that you may consider following for the management of pathobionts. Step 1 is to test the microbiome. Then we need to evaluate the clinical case. We need to then consider the cause, and most importantly, treat the cause. So what I want to do is I want to spend the next little bit going into each of these steps and providing you with a bit more information. So the first step is to test the microbiome. And perhaps the most important thing we need to do is we need to rule out any pathogens requiring medical attention or referral or treatment. Once that is done, then we can follow on with these steps. We also want to consider the diversity of the microbiome. As Dr. Paula Smith-Brown mentioned, a diverse microbiome is stable and resilient. So with taking that information into consideration, we can better understand the whole microbiome and the impact of any antimicrobials or the impact on pathobionts on the whole system. We also want to identify overabundant pathobionts. Now, this is the key thing. Most people will have pathobionts within their microbiome, but they will be under what is seen in the healthy cohort. It may only be a potential avenue of treatment when they're overabundant compared to the healthy cohort. We'll also want to consider whether or not there's any underabundant commensals, so the good bacteria within the gut. And lastly, when it comes around to testing the microbiome and understanding the microbiome, is evaluating to see whether or not there's any functional dysbiosis. So these are your microbial markers. From there, we want to evaluate the clinical case, and this is broken down into 3 components. We really want to, under every situation when it comes around to pathogen and pathobiont management, is to apply the results to the individual. So we need to look at their clinical symptoms. We need to have an understanding, are they a vulnerable individual? Are they elderly or a child? Do they have severe symptoms or persistent symptoms such as diarrhea, fever, and abdominal pain? Is that indicating that the pathogen or pathobionts may be contributing to the clinical picture? We'll also want to take into account the GI markers, especially the red flags, calprotectin, lactoferrin, and occult blood, to get a better and more comprehensive understanding as to the impact of potential pathogens on the microbiome and within the gut. And then lastly, we need to consider which pathogen or pathobionts is there and whether or not we actually need to be treating it. So as integrative practitioners and naturopaths and nutritionists, one of our core philosophies is to consider the cause, to really dive deep, and rather than just prescribing an intervention for a symptom, but to get a better understanding on the cause behind it. So here are a few things to consider when looking at the potential cause of a pathobiont. We want to get a better understanding on the gastrointestinal function and environment. Do they have low stomach acid, which could be contributing to an overabundance of oral species? Do they have any functional dysbiosis that we need to consider in relation to, do they have high levels of hexa-LPS? Shall we target that? We also want to consider their underlying condition. What condition do they have, and how may that impact on the microbiome and the potential pathobionts? Reviewing any medical history. Are they taking proton pump inhibitors? And is that the reason why there's elevation in oral species? Rather than trying to come at it from a kill, kill, kill perspective, if we can't take a step back, look at the cause, we may come to the conclusion that the overabundance of oral species, including those Streptococcus species, may not be detrimental. It may just be indicating low stomach acid. Of course, evaluating dietary factors. Is there an elevation in pathobionts because the patient isn't consuming sufficient dietary fiber or prebiotics to support with a healthy microbiome? And then, of course, lifestyle and stress. Are they in a fight and flight response where their body can't rest and digest? So at the beginning, I asked you two questions. I'm going to ask you these same questions again. Are antimicrobial herbs the best option to manage all pathogens and pathobionts? What are the other options available in pathogen and pathobiont management? So the last step is to treat the cause. Now, I'm going to discuss this, and then I'm going to give you a number of different case studies on how I would best support that patient based on their microbiome. So when it comes around to treating the cause of a pathobionts, one of the most useful things that we can start off with is by implementing the MetaExplore personalized insights. These insights, myself, Dr. Paula Smith-Brown and the team spent almost a year developing, researching to show what are the evidence-based suggestions and insights that you as a practitioner can prescribe to your patients based on their own unique microbial markers. From there, when it comes around to pathobiont management, we want to maximize microbial diversity and richness. How can we improve that diversity and richness of the microbiome? We want to support with digestive secretions and motility. So those core integrative and naturopathic approaches to support with gut health, they're going to be supporting with an overabundance of pathobionts. So supporting with digestive secretions and motility, getting out, doing some exercise to support with motility. We'll also want to review and evaluate whether or not there's any gut inflammation or, of course, increased intestinal permeability. And if there is, we'll want to manage that to better support our patients with an overabundance of pathobionts. And lastly, we want to optimize diet and lifestyle to support with a healthy microbiome. So the first thing we need to consider here is if your patient presents with a combination of acute diarrhea, severe abdominal pain, fever, bloody diarrhea, unexplained weight loss, this requires an immediate referral to a healthcare professional to ensure that the proper investigation is done rather than waiting for the results of a microbiome test. But let's say we undertake a microbiome analysis and your patient comes up with a potential pathogen, a E. coli 0159 strain. And we're looking at some of the GI markers, and there's elevation in calprotectin above 200. Lactoferrin is still negative, but there's positive occult blood. The most appropriate course of action here is a referral for not only further investigation, but to understand why and to provide the patient with any medical treatment if required. So let's take another example. What if the patient presents with rheumatoid arthritis, they have some food sensitivities, constipation, weight gain, fatigue, and upon reviewing their pathogen panel, it was all negative. So there's no pathogens detected. But looking at their metagenomic results, we can see that there's a number of pathobionts. Now, these pathobionts are known to produce hexa-LPS. So hexa-LPS is elevated, right? But we can also look at the GI markers, and there's no calprotectin, lactoferrin, and negative for occult blood. So what would be the course of action here? Competitive exclusion. Feeding up the microbiome utilizing GOS or galacto-oligosaccharides has been shown in the research to reduce E. coli, a hexa-LPS producing species. So something to consider here when it comes around to feeding up the microbiome to reduce those hexa-LPS producing species is we need to start low and go slow, starting off with a very low dose of GOS and slowly working your way up to about 5 grams. Because I guarantee it, if you go in at a very high dose too quickly, your patient will have a number of adverse reactions. All right, here's another example. Patient presents, they've got digestive health problems, reflux, bloating, indigestion, a lot of stress and anxiety, sounding like most patients that present to my clinic. And upon looking at their oral species, we see that there is an overabundance in oral species within the microbiome. So here are a number of different oral species that could be within the report. What's the treatment direction here? Should we be prescribing antimicrobial herbs to kill these pathobionts? No, we should be taking a step back, looking at the cause and treating the cause. And in this case, it very well could be a lack of stomach acid. So implementing your core integrative and naturopathic approaches of supporting with stomach acid production and release. So apple cider vinegar with meals, utilizing herbs such as ginger, black pepper, gentian, or even betaine hydrochloride. Lifestyle interventions such as vagus nerve stimulation, stress management. If there's stress and that's impacting the release of digestive enzymes and hydrochloric acid, consider implementing yoga and meditation. Even gut hypnotherapy may be useful. Another example is a patient presents with IBS type M. They've got bloating, a change of bowel motions, fatigue, a bit of skin issues, poor sleep. Now, upon looking at their microbiome, their metagenomic results, we can see that there is an overabundance of pathobionts. So these are common pathobionts that you will see in your patient's microbiome results. Now, these pathobionts, they commonly produce these microbial markers. So they commonly produce branched chain amino acids, trimethylamine, hydrogen sulfide. But rather than, and this is in my clinical perspective, rather than coming in and focusing on the microbial metabolites, we can take a step back and go, oh, maybe the overabundance of these pathobionts could be contributing to the patient's poor microbiome and clinical situation. What can we do to change the pathobionts within our patient's microbiome? Here are a few of my top suggestions. We want to increase dietary fiber in their patient, in their diet. So increasing dietary fiber to 38 grams for men and 28 grams for female. We want to incorporate fermented foods, sauerkraut, kimchi, kefir into their diet on a daily basis. Consuming a diverse diet from a variety of different fuel sources will ensure that our microbiome is fed. We can also implement things like resistant starch type 2 found in green banana flour or PHGG. We can also increase beta glucan in our patient, all of which are going to be supporting their microbiome and regulating and monitoring that, so thereby the pathobionts can come down in that overabundance. The other thing to consider here is we as clinicians need to consider other driving factors for the overabundance of pathobionts. So supporting with gut integrity, the mucin layer within the gut, intestinal inflammation and intestinal permeability are all pillars that we need to be considering when it comes around to supporting with the microbiome. So they are the 4 steps for pathobionts management. We want to test the microbiome, evaluate the clinical case, consider the cause, and treat the cause. So as you can see from this evening's presentation, antimicrobials may not be the best treatment option for all pathogens and pathobionts. And not all pathogens, pathobionts, and opportunistic pathogens actually need eradicating. It comes down to their clinical symptoms. I always like to follow the test, don't guess. Understand what's happening within the microbiome before we start implementing a treatment protocol. And of course, if you believe that there is pathogens based on their microbiome, we want to test, evaluate, consider, and treat. I'll now bring Hayley Parcell back on to the stage.
Thank you, Brad and Paula, for your presentations. Are very insightful and I would say thought-provoking as well. And we'll really, I think, have a lot of practitioners considering how they might be addressing patients' microbiomes in practice. Looks like we're having a few technical difficulties there with the screen. We'll just give it a moment. Okay, so the MetaXplore range of gut microbiome and gastrointestinal health tests that were referenced are from Co-Biome by Microba. And Co-Biome is a brand that leverages Microba's deep expertise in the gut microbiome and combines this with clinical expertise to support your clinical decision-making. Each MetaXplore test within the range will utilize metagenomic sequencing technology, and there will be optional additions to each level of testing. The MetaXplore tests as a base provides metagenomic sequencing in order to understand the individual's unique microbiome and its potential function. The metabolites will provide information on the potential risk and benefit of the microbiome and provide in-depth practitioner insights for review within the client's clinical picture. Next, we also have the MetaXplore GI test, which will provide the same in-depth microbiome profile with the addition of 7 gastrointestinal health markers. And these include pancreatic elastase, secretory IgA, zonulin, stool pH, calprotectin, lactoferrin, and lastly, fecal occult blood. And the last test within the range is the MetaXplore GI Plus, which is our most comprehensive test and will include the comprehensive gut microbiome profile, those 7 gastrointestinal health markers that I just mentioned, as well as PCR testing for diagnostic pathogen detection. Please note that the pricing included here is recommended retail pricing in Australian dollars. For all Co-Biome registered practitioners that have attended tonight's webinar, or for practitioners that register to watch the webinar and the recording within the next 2 weeks, you'll be actually able to access 20% off unlimited kits from the MetaXplore range until midnight on Wednesday, the 2nd of August, 2023. To access this discount, you'll just need to complete a short survey shown at the end of the webinar or use the link that's provided on screen at the moment. Once your survey has been submitted, you'll be shown a discount code, and just make sure to note that one down so that you can share it with your patients over the next 2 weeks. They can then enter that discount code at the time of purchase to receive their 20% off. And just quickly, for those already using the MetaXplore range, I just wanted to highlight a couple of enhancements that you'll actually be seeing in the report over the next few days. So we have some exciting enhancements, and the Co-Biome team have been working hard to implement these innovative features to enhance your experience. Firstly, we will be updating the interface for the report, and that's going to provide you with a nice, sleek and intuitive layout, making it much easier to analyze your patient results. There will also be a new feature where you will be able to download reports as a PDF directly from the report, as shown here. And that will allow you to save, share, and print them in just a few clicks. Next, we will actually be introducing additional features into the species table or filters, which will allow you to filter the species information by bacteria, archaea, fungi, parasites, protists, and as we've been talking about tonight, oral species as well, which is a great new addition. And then lastly, the results matrix will be having some new enhancements made as well, which will enable you to be able to filter by patient results, the patient results by range, marker type, and health category. So as I mentioned, these will be released into all MetaXplore reports within your portal and all new reports later this week. And we'll send you some information about that when that change is about to occur. So that brings us to the Q&A for the evening. And I note that we are actually at time, because this is a big topic, there's lots to talk about, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions that have come through. So I hope you will be able to join us and hang around for a little bit longer as we go through some questions that have come through for the evening. So I might just start off here with the first question. Why do patients feel better after antimicrobial herbs if they're maybe actually doing so much damage for the microbiome? Obviously, we've been using antimicrobials in practice for many, many years, and we do see that patients feel better after taking them. So Brad, I might jump to you to give an answer for that one.
Yeah, definitely. And it's one that back in a number of years ago, when I was using quite a lot of antimicrobials, patients would say, yes, I have improvement in clinical symptoms. But we need to take a step back and go, what is our role in healthcare? Are we addressing those symptoms, or do we want to address the cause? And so really ensuring that we are addressing the cause rather than just prescribing something that reduces the symptoms short term is what we're trying to achieve when it comes around to improving the overall microbiome.
Thanks, Brad. And the next question is around patients. We did speak to berberine specifically tonight, which is quite a common herb used in practice. And so the question was, what do you recommend for patients taking berberine-based supplements more for blood lipid management and blood glucose control? Again, I might jump to Brad for that one.
And that's an excellent question, because there is a substantial amount of evidence to show that berberine supplementation supports with lipid control and blood glucose and so forth. But as the name of this presentation is, first, do no harm. We as clinicians need to consider what are the other interventions that we could be prescribing to support with blood sugar regulation and cholesterol management that isn't potentially causing harm to our microbiome. Off the top of my head, we've got bitter melon, we've got zinc and chromium and cinnamon, all of which have no or limited impact on the microbiome, and then thereby may be a safer option for blood sugar regulation.
And what about candida? Can we treat candida with herbs? Paula, if you'd like to jump in and answer that one.
So candida are a group of fungal species. So as we covered during the presentation, they are, when we look at the whole microbiome, very rarely seen at a level that is at significant and covering the level of detection of 0.01%, though obviously it is something we look for clinically. So we did, when we did the microbiome science review, we did go looking at the research for candida in the gut. When we look at the genus level, so groups of candida species, we did find research which suggested that their presence in the gut microbiome is quite normal in healthy people and is not necessarily indicative of dysbiosis or pathogen infection, and really doesn't need to be worried about. But when we looked at Candida albicans specifically, the species, we did find some provisional research showing that there was a link between increased levels of Candida albicans and inflammation in patients who had Crohn's disease. So the question there becomes, is the Candida causing the inflammation, or is the inflammation allowing the Candida an advantage to grow? And really it's about going through our strategy of what has been detected, what do I know about these species, what's going on in the gut environment, and really making a clinical judgment as to the best approach for your patient. Do you want to try and target that particular species with the hope that it would change the symptoms, or do you want to perhaps target the inflammation and create a better gut environment? And what are the potential benefits and the potential for damage or collateral damage? And through that process, hopefully we've given you some framework how to think through making that clinical decision.
That's a really great way to frame it, Paula. And I think sometimes it may actually be flipping things on its head a little bit as to how we might traditionally think about the microbiome, that perhaps the environment is what's allowing some of these pathobionts to potentially grow. And that's actually what needs to be addressed rather than the pathobiont itself. And so the next question we have is, are antimicrobial herbs a better option than antibiotics for the microbiome? That's probably quite a controversial question too. So who would like to jump in and tackle that one?
I'll go for that one, Hayley. And it's an interesting concept. And at the end of the day, it comes down to, because there is limited research on antimicrobials versus antibiotics using metagenomic sequencing, we don't fully understand. Putting on my traditional Ayurvedic herbalist hat, I would like to think that our herbs in some clinical situations could be safer for the microbiome, but then in other clinical situations, antibiotics are going to be the preferred method because they can target particular pathogenic strains or species.
Thanks, Brad. Now we have a question here on antimicrobial use in SIBO treatment, because obviously, the small intestinal microbiome is different to the large intestinal microbiome, and sometimes antimicrobial usage is required to be able to address this clinical situation. So the question is, I use antimicrobials in SIBO treatment. How do we strike the balance between treating SIBO and potentially harming the colonic microbiome?
I'll jump in on this one. It's one of these things where we have for quite some time been using antimicrobial herbs for SIBO. And I like to follow my 4 rules when it comes around to using antimicrobials in SIBO-based patients. And that involves test, reflect, protect, regenerate. So test the microbiome, understand the microbiome. We want to protect the microbiome. So what can we do to protect the microbiome? And then once we've utilized antimicrobial herbs, can we regenerate the microbiome? The other thing to consider is there's so many other avenues that we can employ as practitioners when it comes around to SIBO to support our SIBO-based patients. I like to use ginger to support with peristalsis and a number of other interventions. I'll also note here the relapse on SIBO. So there's a number of papers that came out in the last couple of years that showed using either antibiotics or antimicrobials, there was a relapse of SIBO a number of months later. So was the antimicrobials actually addressing the root cause of the SIBO, or did it just mask it for a number of months?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure a lot of practitioners can attest to that sort of relapse situation. I know I've certainly seen that in practice as well. So we'll just ask another couple of questions here. So the next question I might direct for Paula. I know there are many ways to treat a patient, but if someone has high hydrogen sulfide producers and IBS symptoms, do you not find that fermented foods and high fiber will increase their symptoms even if you increase it slowly?
So high hydrogen sulfide, and what was the other?
High hydrogen sulfide producers in combination with IBS symptoms.
Okay, yes. So in terms of hydrogen sulfide, there's a real common misconception, which again, it reflects the evolution of the technology. So in the past, we would have very much focused on the sulfite reducing bacteria because they were fairly they're a very small group of bacteria, but they're fairly easy to detect using older style technologies. But now we have metagenomic technologies that look at the overall microbiome. We have studies to suggest that, in fact, the sulfite producing bacteria create a very small fraction of the hydrogen sulfide production in the gut. And in fact, the majority of the hydrogen sulfide production in the gut comes from protein digesting bacteria, which digest the sulfur containing amino acids in the diet. So those are cysteine and methionine. So what we've done in the science review process is gone looking for evidence-based approaches to reduce the amount of hydrogen sulfide production in the gut, if that is what the functional dysbiosis that's identified in your patient. And in that case, we have research that suggests the most targeted approach would be to ensure that the patient is not over-consuming sulfur-containing amino acids in the diet, cysteine particularly. So that's from things like poultry and fish and eggs. Though, of course, making sure that they're meeting their minimal requirements of sulfur and protein, which are important nutrients, but also we have in vitro studies, I think even actually a human study, sorry, that shows that if we provide fiber, but particularly FOS, to the microbiome, it can actually direct those microbes away from digesting the protein and creating hydrogen sulfide. So yeah, we have targeted recommendations, and obviously if a patient has IBS, we might be a little bit more careful and not choose FOS. We might choose other more slowly fermented fibers to take the same approach. So it's really that example of how we take the evidence of where we're at and then apply it to our patient clinically. I felt that was a quite complicated question, so I'm wondering if I've answered it. But in terms of does it lead to symptoms, everyone, as Brad, I think very carefully said, is that everything must be done in the clinical context of your patient, but also slowly. So anybody who goes from eating no fiber to lots or no fermented foods to lots suddenly is going to have symptoms. So it's about adjusting that, but also letting patients know that a little bit of gut symptoms is a sign that the gut microbiome is adjusting and working. And so if they can, we don't want them to be terribly discomfort, but telling them to expect a little bit of bloating and a little bit of gas while they adjust can also be a good way to help them persist and get the benefits.
Thanks, Paula. And I think we might just take perhaps just one more question before we wrap up for the evening. Let's see. There's a couple of quite large questions here. So if we didn't get to your question tonight, we will absolutely make note of those and reach out to you directly to answer those. So one of the questions here was, what changes have you seen in the gut microbiome in patients on a keto or carnivore diet? Paula, I might jump to you on that one as well. I know, having seen thousands and thousands of these tests, you may be a good one to give some anecdotal observations.
Oh, that's a good, tricky question. Generally, I've worked at Microbiome for 5 years now. I've had lots of roles, but one of the roles that we did have was working at in the coach service. So I spent a lot of time talking to people who were on these diets, and really, we tend to see signs of a very starved microbiome. So generally these diets are very low in fiber, very high in protein. So we're getting a situation, the opposite of what I was talking about in the hydrogen sulfide, where we're not getting enough fiber to the microbiome and we're getting far too much protein to the microbiome, which is really promoting that protein degradation, which leads to those production of metabolites, which are more pro-inflammatory. So that's encouraging the growth of branched chain amino acid producing bacteria, trimethylamine producing bacteria, and also those hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria. So although sometimes these people will say, like, well, my gut symptoms are so much better, and of course they are, because you're literally not creating any beneficial short chain fatty acids and causing any gas, that's one of those where we've got the short-term benefit of cutting the symptoms, but we haven't got to the root cause of why they may be having those symptoms and putting in place a sustainable long-term solution. So we generally would be encouraging those patients to be increasing the levels of fiber in their diet.
Okay. Thank you very much, Paula. So we might leave it there for this evening, and thank you everyone for bearing with us as we've run a little bit over time tonight, but we hope that the Q&A was offered some additional insight. So to learn more about antimicrobial herbs and the gut microbiome, we do have some additional resources available to you, including our new pathogen management guide, as well as our extensive interpretation guide, which will talk you through interpreting both the PCR and the metagenomic information for pathogen detection. So we will be sending out the slides for tonight's webinar within the next couple of days, and the recording will also be live. So if there's any, will also be available on the website soon. So if you have any colleagues that would be interested in the information contained tonight, do feel free to reach out for them. And if you could just stay on the line and complete that survey to get your 20% discount for your patients, that would be great. And so we'll leave it there. Thanks everyone, and have a great evening.